if anything, it's how does the leader make themselves redundant in their own team, which is a dreadful thing to say, but that's really what you're trying to do is how do I do myself out of a job so I can take the next opportunity or the person below me can take my opportunity and it creates that flow in the organization.
Hello, my name is Shirley Kavanagh and you're very welcome to the Leadership Discoveries podcast. In this series, I chat with leaders across a variety of sectors and geographies who share their experience and views on a range of leadership topics. And I'm delighted today to have Tony White with me. Tony has heaps of experience in global talent management and leadership development. He started his career in the military and has worked across a diverse set of industries, including financial services, healthcare and technology. And he's also held global learning and talent roles in Inicia, Coca-Cola and Allianz, and recently has founded Bruna Learning. Tony, you're very welcome.
Thanks very much, Shirley. A lovely introduction. It's nice to be here.
And it's lovely to talk to you again. I always enjoy our conversations and they could go on for a long time. So I'm going to have to be firm with us, Tony, on this particular one.
Absolutely.
I mentioned there that you started off in the military and then you transitioned into the corporate world. And it's always very interesting to hear from people who've made that transition. And I'm just wondering, what can we learn from leadership from that particular context that we can bring into the corporate world?
It's a long time ago now. It was at the start of my career, but I think it's been very formative in terms of the approach that they take in building people up and teaching people skills. I think it's very different. Like you're faced with a very different environment that you're operating within, and your skill becomes a life or death decision. So they drill you and drill you and drill you and build you up. So a lot of repetition is put in place to make sure that you're the best of the best and you're good at what you do. I suppose when you move into corporate life, that's the desire, but there's a little bit less discipline in terms of that driving people forward. So I think if I was to look back, one of the things that they do really well is, and it might not be for everybody, which is they're really good at building you up and they make you feel like $1 million, and then they'll break you, and then they will build you up from that break again, and then they'll break you again. So you never get ahead of yourself. You never get to think, oh, I'm the greatest at what I do, because you've always got something else to learn to get better at the skill that you're developing. So I think I've taken that, which is build yourself up, but never get too far ahead of yourself. Never be too sure, because there's always somebody out there that's going to have a better skill than you or better at you at that. And so you've got to keep developing, keep learning. And I think that's that whole thing that we talk about in the corporate world of CPD, that continuous professional development. I think a lot of that comes from sort of experiences that people have had in institutions like the military or like civil service or the police force or services to society. Nursing would be a good example where, and the healthcare sector, where people are continuously professionally developing to keep ahead of the game. And I think we have a lot to learn from those sort of experiences that people have had, and yet probably they're not as revered as, oh, I went and did an MBA in Harvard, or I did a bachelor's in certain things. Some of the life skills that these people bring and get taught in those institutions are as valuable, if not more valuable than an academic qualification at times.
Yeah, and it's really interesting what you're talking about, the learning piece there and that continuous learning. And I suppose the humility to recognize that actually I need to learn more. And I think also, it's interesting when you mentioned the healthcare sector, all of, frontline people who do a lot of learning, after action reviews. Some great things have come from those sort of areas of life that we transfer into the corporate world, which is great.
Absolutely. I think the one that you mentioned there, Shirley, that after action review is probably one of the most critical things that a lot of people neglect, which is to take that time to do that reflection after the end of a project or the end of when they complete something, to say, okay, what went well, what we could have done better, and what would we have changed. In the corporate life, things are moving that quick that a lot of people say, oh, I'm busy and I don't get the time to do it. And yet probably the most critical learning points come from taking that time at the end of a project to do that after action review. And that's a discipline. Again, I'll come back to that word discipline. That's a discipline that they teach in the military, which is after every encounter, after every exercise, every operation, there's an after action review.
And you don't have to boil the ocean with that either, Tony. Sure you don't. It can be really quick and no blame and just focused on learning.
Absolutely. It could be 10, 15 minutes. That's all you need to do. But again, I think one of the lessons in leadership that they sort of teach is it's about everybody being involved in an after
Mm.
action view. It's not just the top of the organization or the senior leaders suddenly get around the table and go, oh, let's have a look at the project. No, no, you want the people that were rolling their sleeves up and getting stuck into it also to be involved in that, because they might have some insights that you wouldn't even see.
You mentioned something there, Tony, that I'd really like your view on, which is around this whole piece around culture and, culture of learning, building a culture of learning within an organization. And we've had, learning organizations which were very glamorous at one stage, but probably in practice we haven't really seen them be implemented. Or have we? Maybe you have a different view on it. Can you just tell us a little bit about that cultural piece around learning?
I think learning is very much in vogue at the moment. Again, so we generally go through these cycles where it's not as valued, and then all of a sudden it gets really valued. I think a lot of the emphasis from the World Economic Forum in the last couple of years has been on the speed of skills and the need for skills. So organizations then started to look at how do we adapt to that, and how do we invest in those skills. And so the responsibility is the chief people officer, the chief HR officer, to sort of set that tone and say, what are we going to build? And yet, if I go back 25 plus years to Motorola, I'm going to be very colloquial now, which is Motorola was based in Swords in County Dublin. They had two facilities in the early 90s there, one that was doing pagers and one that was doing phone batteries and chargers. But their culture was, I mean, back in 95, they had a 40-hour a year learning target for every employee, that every employee should receive 40 hours of development. Back in 1993, it's 30 years ago that they were doing this. And we're talking about this 1 hour a week of learning now, which is pretty much 40 hours of learning a year. And we think, oh, it's revolutionary. And so a lot of organizations like the HPs, the Motorola's, the sort of the GEs of the world sort of put a lot of the building blocks and foundations in place. And then we started to move at the speed of the internet, and everybody sort of forgot some of those key learnings from those organizations, the IBMs, as I say, the HPs of the world. And now they're coming back in vogue again, which is right. So you need that CPD culture, you need that learning culture. And I think you're right, Shirley, which is, do they exist? Does that real learning organization exist? Yeah, I think the Germans have a lovely word saying "jein," which is yes and no. So "jein," they do exist, and they don't exist. I think of Microsoft as being one of those sort of standout organizations at the minute. That Satya Nadella, the CEO, said learning is really important when he said, I want to transform Microsoft from this know-it-all culture to a learn-it-all culture. And there's a lot of companies now that aspire to have that similar type environment, which is how are we learning? How are we growing? And I think part of the challenge that organizations face today is you can't just pay it lip service. You can't just say, oh, we're going to have a learning culture and then say, that shall do. Everybody else shall do it and have their 40 hours of learning a year, or their 1 hour of work, 1 hour of learning at work a week, or whatever that might look like. The executive team have to do it as well. They have to be the ones that are saying, look, we're still investing in our development. We're still learning. We're still growing, because it's a bit like that behavioral change. You can't see, you can't be. If I can't see that my leaders are doing it, then why would I do it? To create the culture in the organization, then I think that has to be really visible. And I don't think there's a lot of visibility in a lot of organizations. They're expecting the middle managers to drive it, and from there down, rather than role modeling it from the top.
One of the things I suppose we're facing into, and we're all, we've probably been through part of it this year as well, is, economic uncertainty. And we both know that within organisations, the budget that will take a hit first are usually some of those softer budgets that can't, or are perceived to not be able to deliver tangible benefits. So what, I suppose, advice do you have for either chief learning officers, CHROs, or senior business leaders in terms of to get value out, bang for your buck in terms of your training, learning, budget, development, whatever you want to call it? What do they need to do?
It's the age-old question, Shirley. I don't know. I don't think there's a simple answer to it. But look, there's multiple things that can be done, and it doesn't have to cost the world either. And what I mean by that is, we look at the simple model that Charles Jennings put in place, the 70-20-10 model. Says 70% of learning comes from experience, the 20% from coaching and peer learning, and the 10% from sort of formal academic education. And I think that model has been misused and abused in a lot of organizations as a means to say, well, 90% of our investment should be in free stuff and only the 10% should be invested in. So our budget should reflect that. Yes, there is that. And what I would say is that there's times when you need to invest in formal education because of upskilling, because there's a gap in your organization or there's a need for the future that people have to do. So invest while times are good rather than waiting for the time to be bad to do it, because often we start to think, oh god, we've got to react to something now and therefore it's going to cost us more. How do you become proactive in these? Think of AI. Everybody's now rushing to upskill their teams in AI, and yet we've known about AI for 5 to 10 years, and what organizations could have been preparing for some of this transformation and change in skill set requirements beforehand. So how do you get ahead of the curve? And I know it's difficult. It's easy to say oh, AI was around 5 to 10 years ago and we can invest. However, you've got to be horizon scanning. You've got to be looking at what are the next trends, what are the academics saying, what are the future forecasters saying in these things, and start to try and get ahead of and make the investments ahead of the time, because then it's cheaper.
And Tony, just what you're saying there in terms of, we have known about some of these things and it is about foresight and looking forward. Is this a problem for HR people in general in terms of their access, let's say, to to the strategic perspective of the organization? Are HR folks doing enough in that space?
I think in any function, sometimes, Shelley, we get the blinkers put on us and we get so consumed by our own topic that we forget to stand out and stand back and look at the system. What does the system of work tell us? What's going on in the bigger system of the world? And there's so much information available should you want to go and find it. I mean, I've worked with organizations like the IFTF, the Institute for the Future. They're a not for profit based in Palo Alto, West Coast US. They do fantastic work on future forecasts and what the future, they're not trying to say it's going to be like this, but this could be a possible future. So they look at different horizons and what may happen. And some of their reports, there's one I still use on Learning Today that's probably 10 plus years old, where they looked at the future of learning and what the trends that could happen. And one of them was, how do we befriend the machine? How do we become, and they were saying in the future, we may work for AI and we may not be working for a human being. We may end up being employed by AI. And that those realities are starting to happen in the world today. AI has started to employ humans to try and get things done as well. But it wasn't a HR report that's going to tell you that. It wasn't a CIPD. It wasn't the latest marketing research. That we have to look beyond our spheres of expertise and say, what is the bigger system doing? Things like the reports from the World Economic Forum, from McKinsey, and you look at some of the trends that they look at, BCG, some of the big consultancy groups do a lot of research in this space. And yet, are we reading it? Oh no, it's about technology. So it's not part of HR, so I'm going to discount it. That's the real challenge for us, which is opening our minds up to say there are other pieces of research that we need to be informed of that will inform what we're going to do in the future as well.
Can I just take you back just a little bit earlier on to what you were saying there? Because, when we started talking about this piece, you mentioned about leaders and, what do leaders need to know? And I'm really interested in your view. I mean, how do we educate or equip leaders for a very different world? We know it's been transitioning into that place, all right, but the pace is still going to continue. So how do leaders who may be in the role for 10 years or whatever, or 20 years, I don't know, how do we get them, or how do they get themselves ready and comfortable in this environment that we're, now really sort of really getting immersed in?
It's a really challenging question that I don't think there's a single answer or a simple answer to. I think there's a number of things that leaders need to be doing. One is investing in themselves. So, and that doesn't need to be financial investment. That's investing their time in themselves. So whether that's making sure they're fit and healthy, making sure that they're resilient in terms of their own physical well-being, looking at their mental well-being, what are they doing to disconnect? What are they doing to make sure there's space for other things in life apart from work? And I know that sounds like it's non-technical, it's non-quantitative in terms of time
Hmm.
and being able to sort of look at things. But it's so important to be able to disconnect from work and to invest in yourself and your own energy. Because if you've lost your energy, then how are you giving your energy to others? So I think that's one thing that the leaders need to do is what are they doing for themselves, physical, mental health, well-being, that type of thing. Then it's about how well read they are. So what are you doing? And again, you don't need to read the book anymore. You can go into an AI, whatever your AI poison is, whichever your poison of chalice is, and just ask it to summarize the book for you in however many pages you want to read. So if that's what you want to do, you can just ask AI, please summarize War and Peace for me in 10 pages. And it'll give you a beautiful summary of War and Peace. We don't have to spend or invest as much time in trying to learn that rote knowledge that a lot of people did in the past because we have access it to our fingers. And the other piece is being comfortable in the chaos. So how do you deal with the chaotic world? And again, I'll go full circle back to the military piece, Shirley, which is one of the things that the military teach you to be very well comfortable with is in a chaotic environment, because when all hell breaks loose in a battle, you have to remain calm, because if you don't remain calm, then it gets even worse. So what do you need to do? It's how do you remain clear of mind, clear thought? So as a leader, if looking at the future, we could get completely blown away. Our minds could be completely overwhelmed with AI, Gen AI. What's the latest trends? Are we doing agile this week? Was it Lean Six Sigma last month? Is it supply chain excellence next month? Is it marketing X on whatever the next trend may? And we could be consumed by all of that. Or we know our direction of travel. We know what we need to do. We know we're well drilled. I know what skills I have and what I need to do. And I'm comfortable in this environment that's chaotic around me because I can provide clarity to my team. I can provide direction to my team. And it comes back to those fundamental things. Can I show them the way to go? Do I know what I have to deliver? And how am I engaging them in that process? Leadership's quite simple when it comes down to it, but yet we over complexify it, or we make it so complicated. Thankfully, that's a good case because people like us get asked to come in and help people with leadership interventions as a result. But again, our job is to simplify it for people and to make it easier for people to understand.
I love the way you've answered that question, I have to say. And, I know you're very commercially focused. You're very driven. You're very focused on learning interventions and the right intervention and very focused on talent. And it's interesting that you start off with mind yourself. Look after, keep your mind clear, mind your energy. I really love that. And then this piece around comfortable in chaos. I don't know how many of us are actually comfortable in chaos, but it's a really important message. And this whole piece of clarity and being clear in your mind. I mean, I think there's some great messages that you're giving out there. And you mentioned curiosity as well, Tony, again, which very much exemplifies, your way of working this very curious mind. We've talked about technology a bit there, and I know you embrace technology very much. And I'm just wondering, in terms of the sphere of learning generally for organizations, how do we integrate technology into our learning solutions for the benefit of everybody? Have you any thoughts or any views around that? Loads, I'm sure, but anyway.
and it's I think sometimes technology gets in the way of learning rather than because again, HR and L&D love a good system. So we love to be able to implement things in organizations. We love to be able to put, oh, look at our latest LMS, our learning management system, or look at our latest HR system. Or is it Workday this month, or Success Factors, or SAP, or is it Cornerstone, or whatever your poison is in terms of systems. And sometimes it's not about the technology enabling learning in that regard. How are your leaders enabling learning technology agnostic? So what are the leaders doing to make sure that learning is taking place in your organization? What's the coaching they're giving, the questions they're asking their teams to say, how are we developing as an organization? How are we as a team of people that are working together developing? Versus, oh, I need the next, LinkedIn learning course to be able to do project management. Well, I'm sure that there's probably 25 people in your organization that are wonderful experts in project management that you could go and knock on their door and say, look, I've got a project. yes, I can go and do the LinkedIn learning, or I can go and do whatever the online demand learning platform that you use is, Skillsoft or whatever that might be. But going and having a conversation with somebody then creates a network. It then creates a bond. It then creates somebody, the curious argument or the conversation that you're going to have. That person knows you're interested in their subject. They might then be interested in yours, and you start this learning, virtuous learning circle. Learning can enable this with social networks, with connections, with platforms like LinkedIn or the Facebooks of the world. And I would say, don't worry about the technology. Worry about learning. Technology will assist you in it, but worry about learning, and learning in its rawest sense, through people, with people, acquiring new knowledge. Because in the future, the way, I mean, Sal Khan from the Khan Academy has already said that in the future, everybody will have their own personal AI tutor, or that's his sort of vision for learning in the future. So if that's going to be the case, we're going to be asking the AI tool the same way we would have asked our peer, can you help me with this? Can you help me with that? So I sometimes think that we get too hung up on the technology piece and not enough on what we're really trying to
Yeah.
achieve.
Yeah, great point, Tony. And just, when we're kind of on this piece again about, learning in organizations, use of technology. And if we look into 2025, and if you were talking to chief people officers now or organizational leaders now, what would you be saying that they need to focus on in terms of investment of learning in their organization for their leaders? Are there particular things, or are there things we should be doing anyway, regardless of what the environment is like outside? What advice would you be giving?
There's still some very fundamental things that organizations need to be doing. Go back to Daniel Goleman's piece, which is the IQ will get you your job, the EQ will get you promoted. What are we doing to help our leaders have more emotional intelligence, to be more connected with their people, to be that individual that creates collaborative environments, the social environment for work? So I think the investment is in those skills, which is coaching the leaders becoming coaches. And I know coaching has become very en vogue, and I think it sometimes can take you down a certain rabbit hole, and everybody then wants to become coaches and qualified coaches, and you don't need to go that far. You need the basics of being able to talk to people, ask them those questions, and be inquisitive and inquire about them, because we know people can solve their own problems, and we become those facilitators of that. So I think in terms of where the organizations are investing, invest in your leaders so they are better at coaching and leading their people in the fundamentals. I'll go back to John Adair's model, which is task, team, and individual. It's so simple, and yet it's still so relevant today. What are the tasks that you have set your people to do? What's the team doing to achieve those tasks? And then how are you taking care of the individual in that? Like, it's so basic, but yet it's so critical. And yet, if you go into a lot of organizations and say, have you trained your leaders on something as fundamental as Adair's model or Maslow's hierarchy of needs theory or Hertzberg two-factor? The answer is probably no. It's always baffling when you start talking to people, which is, and I've done it with a lot of blue chip organization. I know you've done this yourself, Shirley, with, you speak to a lot of large organizations that you think have this solved, and they are still struggling and still trying to solve the same problems that the small organizations are trying to solve. And yet the impression is, oh, it must be so much better there because they're a much bigger organization. The reality is often not. Again, don't, I think there's a book called Don't Sweat the Small Stuff. Don't be worried about being like somebody else. Be yourself as an organization. What is it your organization needs for your leaders? So, what are the things that you're driving forward as an organization? So, if it's a very much a sales focused organization, so how are you influencing? What's empathy that you're trying to drive? How are you leading that way? If you're a technology driven organization, how are you providing structure for your engineers or the technical staff that you're trying to drive and deliver on results? So it's about tailoring it for what you need, and the fundamental skills of the leader of connecting with people and trying to help them move themselves forward and developing your teams to be better. if anything, it's how does the leader make themselves redundant in their own team, which is a dreadful thing to say, but that's really what you're trying to do is how do I do myself out of a job so I can take the next opportunity or the person below me can take my opportunity and it creates that flow in the organization. So
And some great points there, Tony. And it gives me a really, really nice segue into my next question, actually, which is around the intersection of talent or talent management and learning. And I know these are two areas that you've lots of experience in, and I also know lots of different views on. Maybe some controversial, but anyway,
yes,
just
yeah.
in terms of what are we not doing well, or what should we be doing better, let's say, in organizations in bringing those two together?
I only spoke the other week about this, which is to an organization of the week about this, which is we seem to create these false walls in organizations between the HR, even within HR. So, is your talent acquisition team allowed to talk to the talent management team, who is allowed to talk to the L&D team? And what I mean by that is we're asked to create a learning and development strategy. So, did you talk to the talent acquisition, the people that are recruiting, about your L&D strategy before you created it? Did you talk to the talent management team? Or is what sometimes happens in a lot of organizations, it's conveniently firewalled, which is we like to create this, oh, we can't give you the data from talent management about our high potentials because that's really secret. And you're like, really? What's so secretive about knowing who the high potential people are in your organization? Because you want to develop them more, or you want to create even more of a oh, look at these people, aren't they wonderful? And so different to everybody else. And I don't think that was never the intent of talent management. So my philosophy in this is how do you create complete transparency between talent acquisition, talent management, and L&D? So they're all working with the same data set, so they're all working to the same goal, rather than at the minute, a lot of organizations I find are they've separated those three things because they're worried about everybody's worried about GDPR. So can I share that data with other people? We all work for the same HR person. We all work under the same HR umbrella. So surely we're all bound by the same confidentiality of employee data using it. So I think we provide excuses for ourselves in organizations not to work together, and HR are brilliant at doing that. And yet we're out as HR espousing to the rest of the organization how they should work together and share their data with us on who their top talents are and who everybody. So there's a sort of bit of a paradox that we're trying to manage, which is in the organization, and attention that we're trying to manage, which is telling everybody else, be transparent with us about who your top performers and your lower performers and the mid performers are, and yet are we sharing that data within the HR function to enable them to do their job better?
And it's really about trust as well, isn't it? You know, that sort of the big thing it comes across to me as you're talking there, which is really, really interesting as well. And maybe we need to see ourselves as a system within a system of the organization as such, instead of
Right.
separate subsystems, really, to.
Yeah. Back to where we started, Shirley, which is if we sit within our own silo, then we're very limited to the view of the world that we've got. We start looking outside of our own silo and what's the best practices that are coming from other functions. So the marketing team are always sharing data with sales and sales with marketing on leads, on lead
Mm,
generation. We should be doing the same within the HR function and to help our leaders to be better and have those better insights and better views. And yet there still seems to be the hoarding of data to some degree in
yeah,
the function.
yeah, I know, and it's really an important point you're making. Tony, just I know in Bruna Learning yourself, you work, with different cultures. I know in the past you've worked in global organizations across cultures as well. And this whole arena of cultural intelligence and leaders becoming more culturally intelligent, I suppose, becoming more and more important actually in the world that we're currently in. Any tips for leaders? How do we build that in organizations?
Yes, you can build it, unless yes, you can educate people. And I use the word educate very different to the word train. Very much we educate people on the cultural nuances, but you really need to experience them to understand them. So, and that's just experiencing a different culture, a different way of working, a different lifestyle, and being accepting of it. So, I would flip the question somewhat, Shirley, and say, how do we become good humans
Hmm.
in terms of if I'm accepting of people within my own environment and I behave in the right way there, and my intention is always positive, then everybody will always see that my intentions are positive. And there's always a lot of forgiveness from somebody else if you make a mistake in their culture, if they can see that your intention is positive. Whereas if you go in with a deliberate way of doing things and a prescription on how you're going to deal with them, or the bias has started to impact you, then you're not being the good human again. You're not
Mm.
being somebody that's looking at the world or the society of the globe. And I know that's a big, lofty statement to make, and it sounds very sort of very, very grand, but fundamentally, it's be nice to others. Like I'm going to go back to my Boy Scout days, Shirley, which was one of the Boy Scouts when I was going through it many, many years ago. It was do a good turn for somebody else every day. And so if we think about that cultural intelligence, do I need to know all the ins and outs of that cultural intelligence if I try and do a good turn for them? Probably not, because they know that my intention was positive. They know that I'm trying to help them. And so, yes, I'll make mistakes along the way. As long as then you can be vulnerable and put your hand up and say, a bit like Amy Emerson says about this psychologically, as long as you put your hand up and show people, look, sorry, I made a mistake. It may be culturally inappropriate what I said. That was never my intention. I now understand that that's not appropriate in the situation that I'm in.
Tony, that's a great way to end this conversation. Reluctantly, I have to say, because I've only touched on some topics that I know that we could have many separate podcasts on, I'm sure. But what a great way to end it, that whole piece around being accepting as humans, empathy, being kind, all of these really important things that are so relevant in today's world as well, and becoming more relevant all the time. Tony, thank you very much indeed. I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. It's been fantastic. Thank you so much. And best of luck as well with Bruna Learning, because I know you're doing some great things with your practice as well.
Thanks very much, Shirley. It was a pleasure. It's delighted to talk to you about it.
And I want to thank you, our listeners, too. I suspect you've come from very different parts of the globe and from within different industries also. And I hope that you have found the discussion as insightful and as thought-provoking as I did. By the way, if you'd like to contact me, you can do that on LinkedIn or on shirleykavanagh.com. To our listeners, I hope this has been as useful to you as it has been for me.